Hey gearheads. In this lesson we'll be talking about exposure. And primarily we're going to be dealing with f-stops, ISO or film speed, and shutter speed. Now f-stops are those little marks or stops on your lens. And if you look at this chart here, you'll see that the most common delineation is thirds of a stop. Now when you look at your camera's EV meter, which is that little plus minus thingy that usually appears at the bottom of the LCD or viewfinder, each little tick is a third of a stop. The big ticks are full stops, and most of the terminology you'll hear me discuss in terms of exposure will be given in stops of light. The second aspect is ISO or film speed. Now in the old days with film, when they talked about with speed was how little time it took to get a good exposure on your film. So when we talk about a fast lens, we mean a lens that's aperture opens up really wide, and so you can get a really good exposure very quickly. And film speed, when they started making better film stocks, those film stocks could get an exposure more quickly. So when we talk about a higher ISO, we're talking about faster film or film speed. Lens speed, we're talking about a bigger aperture, we're talking about a faster lens. But with ISO, what ISO has really become today is not so much film speed as much as sensitivity. So think of higher ISO numbers as being more sensitivity or a higher sensitivity on your sensor. And a quick lesson that you can learn is when you look at the ISO little grid on your camera, you'll see that on most cameras you'll have like 100, 200, 400, 800, 1600, 3200 are all in the same row. And the reason is it's easier to keep that straight because when you double your ISO from 100 to 200, you gain a stop of light. When you double it from 200 to 400, you gain a stop of light. 400 to 800, 800 to 1600, and so on. You gain a stop of light. So if you've got 100 to 3200, you've got, what is that, 5, 6 stops of light, all the way across the board, that you can adjust the sensitivity of your camera to give you a little bit more flexibility so that you can, say, open up your lens, or you can change the ISO so you don't have to stop the lens down, or so you don't have to open up the lens to the point where it becomes really hard to focus. Okay, so the next aspect is shutter speed. Now with actual film, we're more concerned with the shutter angle, and the typical shutter angle is 180 degrees, which is this right here. This would be, would be the camera being exposed and the shutter would rotate like this, and then the shutter would close and the shutter would open. So the shutters open exactly half of the rotation. And this correlates not only with motion blur, but also compensating for flicker. If we reduce the shutter angle, we get less motion blur. If we increase it, we get more. Now this is contrary to shutter speed. Shutter speed is for electronic shutters found in like video cameras. And it measures how fast the shutter opens and closes to expose the sensor. And if we reduce the shutter speed, we get more blur. If we increase it, we get less. The easiest way to recall the correct shutter speed is to double your frame rate. So for instance, if you're shooting 24 frames per second, you'd want a 1/48 per second shutter speed, or 1/50th, which is what we commonly have on DSLRs. Most video cams only have that, which is close enough. For 30 frames per second, you'd want 1/60th, and that's just doubling that to get your shutter speed. But for special effects, like I have a fluorescent light here that's flickering a little bit. So to compensate for that, so it's not flickering on my face, I actually have my shutter speed set to 1/60th, but I'm at 24 frames per second. And you're kind of thinking, okay, I'm not really understanding how that correlates. Well, what we would do in film is we would, rather than shoot with a 180 degree shutter, we'd shoot with about a 144 degree shutter angle. And that would reduce the flicker effect on the film. So let's take a look at this chart here and you'll begin to see how shutter angle, 144 or 90 or 45 in this case, correlates to shutter speeds on an electronic shutter for a video camera. Now, you're probably thinking, okay, shutter effects. On Saving Private Ryan, which is the most common example given, they employed a 45 degree shutter angle, which drastically reduced the motion blur and sort of gave the film that sort of choppy, crisp look. Now, this can be duplicated on your video camera by setting your shutter speed to 200. You can choose the same thing to a slightly lesser degree by employing a 90 degree shutter, which could be simulated by setting your shutter speed to 100. And to eliminate flicker from fluorescent lights like I'm doing here, you'd set your shutter speed to 60. Of course, this is all for 24 frames per second, which if you're shooting movies, which is what I'm trying to teach you how to do, that's mostly what you're going to be shooting on. And then which would be emulate a 144 degree shutter angle. Here's this quick reference here again, so you can see how shutter angle correlates to shutter speed, so that if you want to create different shutter effects, you can. Now keep in mind, the faster your shutter speed, or the more acute your shutter angle, you're going to require more light. So if you're already wide open, you're either going to need more light or you're going to need to bump up your ISO, depending on the situation. But just remember that that when you do that, also when you overcrank, if you're shooting 60 frames per second, you want to double your shutter speed. So you want to shoot 1/20th shutter speed or 1/50th, depending on what you have available on your camera. But again, that's going to reduce the amount of light that you're actually getting into the camera. So you're going to need more light, or you're going to need to bump up your ISO, or you're going to need to go get more light and add it. And that's the basics of exposure.